Um, hey everyone, welcome back to the Level Up webinar series. My name is Jasmine and I'm on ironSource's marketing team. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, Lexi Sydow, Senior Marketing Analyst at App Annie, and Sandra Schneider, VP Partnerships for Europe and the Middle East at ironSource, will walk you through how to maximize LTV for games with hybrid monetization models. Before I get started, I wanted to take a few seconds to tell you a bit more about what we're doing here at ironSource. ironSource is developing the industry's leading growth engine for games. We reach 2.7 billion engaged players a month, and our ad mediation platform is #1 in the market for game developers. If you want to learn more about the solutions we're building at ironSource, you can head to www.ironsrc.com. We'll also be sending out a copy of the deck as a recording of the webinar tomorrow, so watch out for it. And if you want to check out past webinars, you can head to ironsrc.com/webinars. Now I'll give it to Lexi to talk a bit more about App Annie.
Thanks, Jasmine. So I'm Lexi from App Annie. I just want to take a quick moment to talk to you about where the data in the first half of the webinar is coming from. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, App Annie is the mobile performance standard. Through our mobile data and insights platform, we help create winning mobile experiences for our customers who are aspiring to achieve excellence. We provide the industry's most trusted and comprehensive app market data and insights. And all of the insights that we'll share today from the App Annie portion come directly from our App Annie data. So if you're interested in seeing more of these insights, feel free to visit our blog, which is appannie.com/insights, or sign up for a free account at appannie.com. All right. And whoops, sorry, I skipped that one. So just a little bit more about App Annie is that we fuel successful mobile experiences and monetization by providing comprehensive data, a trusted source, and we have a global reach with 12 global offices. Again, if you're ready to take your mobile performance to the next level, you can register for that free account at appannie.com. So just to get the sort of the company statements out of the way, who we are. This is sort of the agenda for today. So I'll take you through the gaming market trends, talking a bit about core games, the impact of ads, SDKs on growth, and then I'll kick it over to Sandra to take us through some of the state of UA and monetization, as well as some best practices for hybrid monetization models. All right, we'll jump right into it. So we'll kind of start first with the gaming market trends. So first, we'll do that kind of deep dive, and we'll look at some category level insights as well. So, and actually, I just want to take a pause before I start talking, actually. We will conclude this webinar with an audience Q&A. So word of advice is, as we're going through these slides, if you have any questions during the talk, just add them in the Q&A box as they come up, and then there's a much better chance of us being able to answer your questions during the webinar if you add it in early versus waiting until the very end. So that was just a little bit of a heads up there. So I think I'll kick it back. All right, so we actually just skipped ahead a little bit here. Okay, so we'll start off first with a bit of a high level look at monetization in the app economy right now. So across mobile, there are 3 ways you can monetize your apps. One is through in-app purchases or paid apps or subscriptions, and that's through the app stores themselves. The other is in-app advertising, and then the third is through m-commerce, which would be when you transact directly with your credit card with the provider. So that would be like an Uber or an Amazon. And this view on this page is showing 2 of those 3. So we're looking at App Store consumer spend, so through in-app purchases for games largely. That's how games typically transact. And then in-app advertising. So what you can see here is that in 2019 alone, App Store consumer spend was $120 billion globally. And to give some context to that, that's apps plus games, and games was about 72%. And that total, $120 billion, is about double the box office industry globally. So that's a huge figure, and it's a big and growing industry. In-app advertising is another portion of that. In 2019, we saw in-app advertising at $190 billion in spend, and that's set to grow to $240 billion in 2020, which is about a 25% growth year over year. So that's pretty incredible. And in 2019, we saw $300 billion total across those 2 monetization pathways spent through app stores and in-app advertising. So for us, it's very clear that mobile is taking over a share of wallet among digital and traditional ad budgets, as well as consumers migrating some of their normal payments into mobile. So instead of buying a game for their console or say paying for that gym membership or that personal trainer, that is actually surfacing through the app stores as in-app subscriptions or in-app purchases in games. So specific to gaming, I wanted to take a quick look at how mobile gaming stacks up against all other forms of gaming. So what we can see here is that in 2019, mobile gaming is far above all the other gaming platforms combined. So that would be PC, Mac gaming, console gaming, and handheld all as one. So this is a pretty impressive figure. We saw that actually it was about 25% above. Mobile gaming was 25% above all those other forms combined, which is pretty impressive. And we've seen that mobile gaming is truly driving the growth. You can kind of see that by the upright trajectory of that, the line here on the chart. As far as mobile relates to consumer spend on PC Mac gaming, it was 2.4 times that item alone and 2.9 times as big as home game consoles in 2019. So some trends have been pretty steady now. We've seen that across the years, and we expect this to continue. In fact, we expect mobile games alone to surpass $100 billion in 2020. Again, this is through the app stores, so this wouldn't include in-app advertising. And for us, what we really see is that mobile has democratized gaming. It allows for a portable gaming console to effectively be in the pocket of virtually every consumer, which is pretty powerful. All right, so next we'll kind of take you through a bit of a more, some of how game splits up among some of the different classifications. So this is some classifications that we've done at App Annie. It's a bit richer than the App Store categories that they provide, and we go a bit deeper. So what we did for this particular analysis is we showed the kind of high-level core, casual, and casino. So games within casual genres led by arcade and puzzle were the most downloaded globally in 2019. Because a lot of the times you see users switch between multiple casual games. So many companies leverage a portfolio of casual games to retain high user bases overall. We saw that publisher Good Job Games had a particularly great year last year with multiple casual games topping the charts. Core games, by contrast, as you can see in the pink, represented about 1/5 of global downloads among the top games. And Free Fire was the most downloaded core game of 2019, which fell under the action subgenre. And another quick note here, kind of a timely note about downloads. So at App Annie, we have seen actually amid the COVID-19 pandemic that's happening right now, we've actually seen really strong increases in gaming downloads. We first saw this trend surface in China. So in February 2020, the average weekly game downloads in China went up 80% compared to the average weekly downloads for the whole of 2019, because more people are self-quarantined, or there was social distancing measures or city lockdowns, and people turn to mobile and turn to their games for entertainment and probably to stay connected and involved. So we really saw those grow, and we also saw the same thing happen in South Korea. That was another market that quickly after China was hit early on by the coronavirus. And we saw those downloads grow 35% in the last week of February compared to the 2019 weekly average, exceeding 15 million downloads during that week. All right, now we'll take a look at time spent. So downloads are the first part of the picture, important for UA, but time spent is that metric that shows how you're engaging people, if they're sticking around, if they're playing, how much of your games are they playing. So while core games represented only 18% of those downloads, you can see here represented in the pink that they are 55% of time spent. So that's a really big figure to keep in mind. Core games tend to drive deeper engagement and longer gaming sessions, and mobile devices now have really made strides in both power and sophistication and the hardware capabilities that enable core games to really flourish. And we've seen that happen with many traditionally PC console games migrate into mobile. Two major ones last year were Mario Kart and Call of Duty. So mobile has the capabilities to support that, and also things like 5G will make it even easier to play those core games on the go. So we really expect mobile gaming to be one of those first, so the first threshold that we see 5G take effect with the rollout of that. And next, we'll take a look finally. So the kind of natural extension is first you kind of look at downloads in a market, and then you look at the engagement. And then what typically ends up happening is more engagement begets more in-app purchase spend. So for games, yes, that's mostly coming from in-app purchases. There are a small amount of paid games that will help with that as well. And so we looked at that, and what we see here is that core really is the big driver of in-app purchases. As we mentioned, the stickiest users spend the most time, so it makes more sense that that's driving a lot of that spend. And what we've really seen is that this is kind of echoing that growing shift towards core gaming in Western markets, which historically APAC has been very, very heavy with core games. And the US, for instance, has been a lot more casual games in the top charts, but we're seeing that shift change. And actually core RPG, strategy, and action games combined, they made up over half of consumer spend in APAC markets like China, Japan, and South Korea. So core games kind of engage gamers deeply, leveraging extensive customization, competitive online play, and season pass memberships to cultivate that stickiness. And in 2019, we saw the #1 core game by consumer spend was Fate Grand Order, which is an RPG. And it's also one other thing we want to draw attention to is that only 1% of total time in the top games in 2019 was spent in casino games, which is that purple slice you see in the chart. But they actually, despite only 1% of time spent, they accounted for 6% of total spend. So that's another area that we're seeing them punch above their weight as far as the spend goes. And Coin Master was actually the #1 casino game in 2019. All right, and a little note about Gen Z. So when we look at user habits, what we see with Gen Z is that they spend more time in games each month than they do apps. So that's impressive. So they are gaming more than they're in their apps, but they're doing that over the course of much fewer sessions. And when we look at those habits, those gaming habits compared to older demos, we really see that actually Gen Z spends 75% less time in their top games than those aged 25 plus. So that's across 25 to 44 and then 45 plus age brackets. So they're engaging, and they also engage in them less frequently, about 45% less frequently. So that's really important to note because that's contrary to what we see for non-gaming apps. We actually see Gen Z engages 60% more than older demos with those non-gaming apps, things probably like TikTok and Snapchat being some of the top ones there. And they spend 40% more time in those non-gaming apps than older demos. So that's pretty valuable information to take into account for your marketing and your UA measures. It's also really important to understand that games are also, as an entertainment factor, they're not only especially for Gen Z, competing with other games. They're competing with those apps that these Gen Zers are spending more time in. They're competing with TikTok for attention, for instance. So that's a really important piece to take into consideration as far as the consumer behavior goes. All right, now we'll move into a quick note about average revenue per user, or ARPU. So we did a quick analysis of the games that were launched in 2019. So typically what we do see is that the highest ARPU, or average revenue per user, we do see a lot of incumbent games that have been around a long time, have a really loyal fan base, and have really got a strong monetization factor in for those users. So we kind of decided to isolate just the ones that were released last year to see which ones performed the best. And across the markets we analyzed, South Korea had the highest ARPU average among all their games. But it's also really interesting to note that China had the highest game among all of the countries we looked at as far as a 2019 release. So that was Perfect World, which is an MMORPG, and that was the #1 game by ARPU in China. And it's sort of like the World of Warcraft of China. It was a well-known PC MMORPG for about 12 years, which kind of puts it in the same league as the Lineage series before it finally debuted on mobile in 2019. So you've already got this level of existing fandom, and then coupled with the advanced hardware specs of mobile, whereas at that point where it could really support a game of that capacity to ensure that high-quality experience. And then you layer in the coordinated global launch they had. They had celebrities. In this case, it was K-pop groups Blackpink's Rosé, and that's a very popular group, one of the only two K-pop groups that have reached 1 billion views on YouTube. Psy Gangnam Style was the first, to give you context for that. So this was a huge celebrity endorsement. They had high-profile commercials and global ad campaigns that really coupled to make this a huge launch. And that's another example of a core game that was traditionally PC that moved onto mobile in 2019. So that's a trend to keep an eye out for, and we expect to see a lot more of that in 2020 and the years to come. All right, I'll take you through my second part of kind of the gaming trends before I hand it over to Sandra. So this is what we're going to look at, the impact of ad SDKs on mobile games. And this is part of a commissioned analysis we did report for Facebook that is a public report. So what we'll look at here, just to kind of kick it off, is that we saw that ad SDKs are increasingly more popular in games, which makes sense given what we've seen with the increasing mobile ad spend. More games are wanting a piece of that pie for their monetization patterns. So specifically, among top games by global downloads in MAU, the share of apps with an ad SDK installed has increased from 83% to 89% throughout 2019. So that's particularly impressive. It's a pretty big jump. And among those SDKs, we found that Facebook Audience Network was one of the top 5 ad SDKs worldwide by game downloads on iOS and Google Play combined. And I think that's something that Sandra will also touch on later as well. And then we're also seeing that the share of top games in consumer spend was increasing throughout the year. And that's an indication that more games are adopting hybrid monetization models, because consumer spend is a measure of App Store consumer spend, so games that monetize through net purchases. And then we're seeing that they're also layering in a level of monetization through ads by adding an ad SDK. So that's definitely a trend that we see continuing into 2020 as well. And so this is another view that we took a look at. So this is similar to the other slides I showed, but this one is actually, instead of looking at just all games and looking at how many were downloaded, we limited that view to the number of downloads of the top 100 games that had an ad SDK. And then we layered that richer classification I mentioned about core and the subgenres that fit into core, as well as casual. So actually, as we've reported in the slide you saw before, in our State of Mobile 2020 report, games within casual genres saw the most downloads globally at 82%. And so among those, with those that had an ad SDK, were almost 10 percentage points higher than the overall share. And that's touching on how users tend to switch between multiple casual games, so companies sort of leverage that portfolio of games for monetization. And overall, actually, we see the core slice there, the pink one represented only about 1/5 of total global downloads globally for all downloads. And then when we look at this chart, in contrast, those core games that had an SDK installed made up less than 10% share. So given that core gamers are among the most engaged segment of the market, that does represent an untapped potential for ad monetization. Okay, now we've done that same view, but we're looking at it from time spent. So the top games by time spent that had an ad SDK installed. And so among those, core games represented only 7% of downloads, yet 76% of time spent in this chart here, which you can see represented in pink. And so in 2019, we saw core games that those core games were led by strategy and RPG games for time spent. And this is a higher share of time spent than it is among core games overall, so including those with and without an ad SDK, where core games' share of time spent was at 55% globally, compared to when you just look at those core games that have an ad SDK, they were 76% of time spent. And so since these genres combined also made up over half of consumer spend in 2019, publishers can explore complementing existing in-app purchase monetization schemes with ad monetization techniques. So for example, the effective use of advertising linked in-game rewards can be an example of something that can boost player engagement and then increase revenue. Okay, now we looked at the kind of pre and post installation period of an ad SDK. So what we found is when we looked at games that installed their first ad SDK, we actually saw that they grew in both downloads and MAU after the ad SDK install. So therefore, downloads in MAU were not negatively impacted by incorporating ad SDKs or incorporating ads in the games themselves. So part of this may be some of the games that are in soft launch and then before they added the SDK for monetization. And this view here is similar, but now we're going to look at that instead of by downloads, and now we're looking at it by time spent. So games that started monetizing via in-app ads increased in total time spent in the months after the ad SDK install. As you can see in this image, that kind of pre and post period is represented. So we're actually seeing that more time spent was spent in those games after the ad SDK install. And now we're looking at that view at just casual games. So not looking at all the games, we're just segmenting down and looking at casual games. And among those casual games that had that installed an SDK, an ad SDK, we saw significant increases in user sessions 1 month after the ad SDK install. So casual games jumped an average of 198% in user sessions during that 1 month kind of post period. And then in the following months, the total sessions remained higher than the actual average of the month before install. And now we'll look at puzzle games. So the previous slide was casual, now we're looking at puzzle games, and we looked at total hours for them. So among puzzle games that had installed an ad SDK, we saw significant increases in stickiness measured by the total hours spent in the months following that first ad SDK install. So puzzle games with ad SDKs averaged a 66% increase in total minutes 1 month after install and a 33% increase during the 3-month post-install period. Total sessions climbed 81% during the 1 month period, and then they climbed 109% during the 3-month periods, respectively. So those are another indication of the engagement going up in a specific genre after adding an ad SDK. Finally, we'll look at simulation games. This is from within the core genre, and we saw that growth across the board in sessions, total minutes, and active users 1 month after an ad SDK install. Specifically, that was 34% increase in sessions, 36% increase in minutes, and 54% increase in MAU. So kind of all together, we've really seen strong increases in downloads or engagement, depending on the subgenre of game, post-ad SDK install, which is pretty powerful to indicate that your monetization method is not infringing on engagement. It's actually counter to that. It's helping users engage more, or they are engaging more as a result. And so now I'll finally kind of just wrap up my section here, and we'll do a note about the diversification of the gaming ecosystem. So this is just one view of that. There are other ways we can look at it, but we chose to kind of look at the consumer spend factor. So this would be App Store consumer spend through games that monetize through in-app purchases, and this also, so it does include games that are paid downloads as well, but that is a very small portion of the total spend. So in 2019, we saw more games than ever before surpass the $5 million mark in annual consumer spend. So specifically, we saw 1,121 games, which is up 15% from 2 years prior. And again, this was just App Store monetization through in-app purchases or paid game downloads. And what was really impressive was we also saw the biggest increase was among games making over 100 million in annual spend per year, which grew 59% compared to 2 years prior. So this is telling us that it's not a winners-take-all market, that more games than ever before are taking a piece of that ever-expanding pie. And in 2020, that pie is set to be $100 billion just for App Store consumer spend on games. So with that, I will now hand it over to Sandra to take us through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Lexi. Let me just request control. Here we go. Okay, cool. That was super interesting. Thank you so much. So I'm now taking over, and we're gonna drill a bit deeper into the ad-related numbers and trends that we're seeing. And after that, we'll dive into the best practices of how to maximize the LTV. for hybrid monetization models, meaning in-app purchase and ads together. So let's start with the numbers. So this is showing you a chart of the IPMs. IPM install per mil, right? I'm just aligning everyone on all the words that I'm using that are very industry related here. So installs per mil, so per 1,000 impressions that you showed, how many installs did you actually get, right? What you can see here is that IPMs are high, and most of all, they're high because of this gray line here, which is representing the hyper casual or ad-based games that are out there. For those games specifically, IPMs are naturally higher because the game experience is lighter than for core games. And so installing is a little bit easier. On top of that, also, I think we're all aware of that, the creatives for these hyper casual games are a little bit more on the aggressive side. So IPMs are naturally higher. And in the data, you can see that there was a spike in the first half of last year. But after that, actually, everything kind of stabilized. And what we see is that successful advertisers are the ones that are beating the IPMs of their own genre. So you don't necessarily need to beat other genres IPMs, and it would be very hard because hyper casual is so much higher than everyone else, right? But it means that you need to be aware of the IPMs of your specific genre, of other games, of your competitive advertisers, and start from there. And how can you actually drive up the IPM, right? So the first part is to be more aggressive on the creative side. You can also increase your scale, and that's option 2 here, by increasing the CPIs. The CPIs is the cost per install that you pay. We'll get into that in the next slide. What that means though is that if you increase your cost per install, you're actually going to lower your margin. So let's look at the prices, the CPIs. What you can see here is I broke this down by genre as well, and this is the exact opposite from the IPM slide, because the hyper casual guys are down here in the gray, and then the action genre is this. By the way, fun fact, I think all of us know of a big launch that happened around October last year of a game that was formerly PC and now is mobile, and that's what spiked this graph here for the action genre, because it falls into this genre. And that's a very interesting trend. Oh, I'm sorry. What you can, well, let me go back. Cool. So prices are higher and there's more competition out there, and it means that mid-core developers or core developers need to actually increase their CPI to buy at the same scale because the competition is just growing. Now, before I show you one last slide with numbers, I want to make sure that we're all aligned on how CPI and IPM are related, right? So the CPI times the IPM actually equals the eCPM of your campaign on the campaign side, right? And I'm showing you this because in the next slide, I want to turn around the view of the numbers, and the flip side of increasing IPMs or high IPMs and increasing CPIs is actually that the ad LTV, so the lifetime value that you make from ads, is growing. So the eCPMs are going up, right? Because if IPM and CPI are going up, eCPM is going up as well. And that means that the share of ad revenue versus in a purchase revenue is growing. So the pie is getting bigger if you know how to leverage that, right? And that's what we're going in next when we start talking about best practices for hybrid monetization models. So let's start with the first step in this. One too many. Okay, cool. So let's start off with find your ad whales, or in other words, how to measure ad revenue, right? You want to know who are your valuable users. So we, Lexi, can you mute? Because I can mute. Awesome. So let's start to ask ourselves, what is actually an ad whale, right? so they're inner purchase whales, which we all know. Inner purchase whales are the guys that are spending real money in your games over time, and that's the guys that you really want to keep close to your heart. So there are also ad whales, right? And ad whales are users that are engaging with ads, so they watch a lot of ads, and on top of that, and the second part, the money part here is important, networks are ready and willing to catch those users in the high price points in your waterfall. How does that actually look, right? Let's see what you need to do in order to measure the ad revenue. So ad revenue is measuring the ad revenue per each user. So I want to know what each user is making me from ads. When I use a mediation model, I have all of the ad units that I'm using, so rewarded video, interstitial, banners, and offer wall, and I want to know how much each user made me from those ad units. What it gives me is it gives me complete visibility of the user's ARPU, not just the inner purchase revenue, which I know already as a developer, I have that, right? So now I am also able to look at the ad value of each user in a very granular level. Let's see how that looks in an example to make it very, very practical. So what you see here is a waterfall of ironSource's mediation. And you can see that Facebook is really high in the waterfall. They have a really high CPM in the first instance. I think it's around $80. Then you have AdMob at $70 and so on and so forth, right? So now let's simulate a user that comes into the game, and that user watches 3 impressions. Oh, one too many. Watches 3 impressions in these instances, right? So the first instance is worth $70 or $80, then $70, then $50. And that's what happened yesterday. So if I would look at the ad value of this user, I would see that he made me almost 20 cents yesterday, which is really nice, right? So this would be a user that I would define as a very valuable user. Now, when I talk about ad whales, a lot of the times clients are asking me, like, how can you know that just because a network is ready to pay a high CPM, it tells you anything about the value of the user, because there might not actually be an install, right? Because we're living in a world of performance campaigns where it's about the install, right? We're not talking about brand campaigns where it's just about watching an impression. There needs to be actually an engagement with the ad. So our assumption here, and the assumption of the industry as a whole, is that if a network has an algorithm behind it, right, like a brain, that can predict or tries to predict the value of the user. So it means that if Facebook is ready to catch user A in their first instance, they get the request for the user from the mediation, and they see whatever they see about the user, and now they decide this user is worth $80 to me, and I predict that I can probably make more from him, right? So this is my basic assumption, why I really think that in a world of flat eCPMs and bidding, actually the impression level and the eCPM that this user gets in the waterfall is like an indicator of the value of the user, even though if I don't know if there was an install or not. So this is how, if you do that across all your users, right? Now you know the value of each and every user. If you pull this from the API that we supply to you, then that's what you get. That's a raw data example. And basically you can see here the value accumulated across all the users from yesterday, let's say. So here in the blue, you have the user ID, which you also have on your side. So you could, in your BI stack, match that with the inner purchase value that you made from that user as well, right? And you see here how many impressions the user watched and what was the value of each of the impressions. I marked here in red the most valuable user in this data set. This guy saw 3 impressions yesterday and had a value of 9 cents. So this is what is out there already, right? User ad revenue, you can pull, you can integrate into your BI stack. Now let's talk a little bit about what's coming on this specific feature, because when we talk about in-app bidding, ad revenue actually gets even more accurate. And why? Because I can see the exact value that the bidder is giving each and every user per each and every impression. So this adds a lot more accuracy to this report, right? In addition to that, we are going to soon release a feature that allows you to break down the ad revenue measurement to the impression level. Right now, you see it accumulated across each user. So I just showed you before in the raw example that we have 3 impressions that this user watched, and they were together worth 9 cents. And I don't know how the breakdown exactly was between those 3 impressions. And we're going to add that very soon in the data breakdown. In addition to that, we are also adding indicators like bidding and non-bidding. We're adding timestamps, so you can actually see when the impression was served. And there's a very interesting example how you can leverage this data, which I'll get into a little bit further down the road. Cool. So now we understand how to measure ad revenue and what it actually tells us, right? So let's look at, we found our valuable users. Now let's give them some love, okay? Or in other words, how to maximize your ad revenue with the data that you just measured. So the first thing that we wanna do is make sure that our ad whales watch as many impressions as possible, because we wanna keep them as close to our heart as our in-app purchase whales. And that's what's important, right? But I want you to think even further. And what I mean by that is that you can take segmentation, because that's what we're talking about, right? Very far. You can build different buckets for different types of users. You can really customize the ad experience. And whenever I talk about segmentation to clients, usually like I'll get reactions like, no, we like ad revenue makes 10% from our total pie. It doesn't make sense to invest anything into that. Even if I get like a very small uplift, like it doesn't make any sense to me. And what I want to show you is that segmentation doesn't need to be complicated. I think it can start from a very basic place, and then you can get more sophisticated as you go. And I want to make a point that it's not as hard as it sounds for you in terms of how to define it and also how to implement it. So let's get started. First, let's ask ourselves why we want to segment, right? It's pretty obvious, but I'm still going to go over it. Every user is different. Every user gets different ads served to them, engages differently with those ads, gets different pricing per ads, right? What we saw before in terms of where the impression gets served. There is difference in, is it a paying user? Is it not a paying user? Some users are not a payer and they will never engage with your rewarded video ads. So what do you do with those guys, right? So there are a lot of like different groups here that you can look into. Before we go into segmentation and actually like a practical way of how to do it, I want to align all of us on what different ad types you have out there to pick from, right? So here on the left side, you see system-initiated ads. And those ads are interstitials and banners, right? We are familiar with them. What they do is they will improve your ARPDAU or ARPU. But they also have a risk for retention because the user didn't actually choose to see them, so they might drop out of the game. So that's the two things that you need to balance against each other. On the right side, you see the user-initiated ad units, which is rewarded video and offer wall. And those guys, of course, also improve ARPDAU, right, because you're showing impressions. And on top of that, they improve the retention. And also they improve the session length. And that's the graph that Lexi showed you before. And there is the risk of IAP cannibalization, which is like the one thing that you need to mitigate when you have user-initiated ads, right? And why is that? Because when you show, let's say, a rewarded video to a payer that rewards him the same amount that he would usually pay for, he would, of course, stop paying for it because he's now getting it for free, right? So that's what you need to mitigate against each other. By the way, I saw before a question, and I'm just going to answer it on the fly in the Q&A. of someone saying why is, it was to Lexi, but it very much relates to me as well. So I'm just going to take it. Why is engagement increasing when you add SDKs? And the reason for that is that usually in games, we're talking about rewarded ads, right? Which reward you something, a currency, a coin, a gem, a life in the game. And that allows you to play more, right? So actually the engagement goes up, the session length goes up, and you also make money on top of it. So it's pretty much a no-brainer. And that's the two ad types. Just want to make sure that we're all aligned on these. Let's go into a very, very basic example of how to segment, right? And how to actually use the data that we just measured in the first step to do the segmentation. So let's say you have a user and he's coming into your game. And now you see, oh, this user is a payer, right? So my ad definition for this user, my ad behavior is that I don't want to show ads. I will say here that you can actually show rewarded video if it is not competing with your in a purchase, currency, right? If your hard currency, the currency that you sell, is not something that you show to these users in a rewarded video, you're fine. You can reward something that you can't even buy. You can reward like any item. You can reward the soft currency. There shouldn't be any cannibalization. So you can be actually a little bit more on the aggressive side with these guys as well, without cannibalizing in a purchase. That's the first group. Now, the second group, that's another user. He's coming into my game. He's not a payer. Now, when are you defining if it's a payer or if it's not a payer? That's really depending on your game. Some can already predict it after 3 days. Some need 7 days. Some are more conservative and they need 30 days. So that's really depending on your game. But let's say this is a non-payer and I've identified that. So now what I can do is I can actually show him rewarded video button and offer wall button, right? And that's a very basic way of doing segmentation, right? That's like a lot of guys are doing this, but I want to take it a little bit further. So now I can ask myself, okay, this user has been seeing rewarded video button and offer wall button for a while. Did he actually click on them, right? Just to remind us, we are talking about system-initiated ads versus user-initiated ads, and that's user-initiated ads that I'm starting with here. So is he an engaged user? Did he click on those? Yes, he did. Okay, cool. And now I can ask myself, okay, is he a valuable user, what we call an ad whale? And if he is, I want to keep him close to my heart. I want him to see as many impressions as possible. So I will show him premium rewarded video buttons. I will increase the rewards that he's getting per each video that he watches. I'll make sure that he also uses the offer wall. And that's my ad behavior defined for those guys. Now, we can take this one further. If the user is a regular user, I've defined him not as a valuable ad user, but as a regular user. I just keep doing what I've been doing. Rewarded video and offer wall placements stay the same. And the fourth group, and this is one that usually hybrid developers are not really going into, which I think is a mistake. And actually, we've seen a trend in the last like 3-4 months that our clients that have make most of their money from in a purchase, but also use ads, actually have been starting to segment this specific group out and change the ad behavior. And I mean the group of users that see the rewarded video and the offer button, but don't click on it. So for those guys, the ad behavior is show them an interstitial or 2 a day, and that's it. This way you'll make money from them, you'll monetize them. And yes, retention is at risk here, but you can ask yourself, is this really a valuable user to you to keep in your game, right? And you can also decide, by the way, when you start doing this. Like if the guy is in your game for 30 days and he didn't pay and he didn't click on an ad, awesome, roll with it, right? So when you sum all of this up, what we just did is we created 4 segments, Group A, paying users, Group B, ad whales, Group C, engaged users, Group D, non-engaged users. And this way is really simple way of kind of starting off segmentation. And again, you can take this really, really far, right? Before I go into best practices that we see from AAA clients that we have, I'll also talk about setting this up, because that's usually like the second obstacle to overcome, right? So what you see here is a screenshot of setting up the segmentation in our mediation. I've created 4 different groups, the way that we just defined them, and I've told the mediation the exact ad behavior that I want these groups of users to get. Now, all you need to do is on the init of the SDK, of the ad SDK of ironSource, pass us the value of those users, the way that you defined it, and we'll kick off this ad behavior. When you do that, by the way, you can also afterwards go into the reporting stack and you can break down by segments, and you actually see metrics per segment, which is really valuable. This is a few best practices that we see from our clients. So on the geo level, right? So if you have a country where in-app purchase is weak, you can use the offer wall, you can increase rewards, you can maybe even use interstitials to really maximize the LTV for these geos. User type would be what we just did. You can also do time of day, which brings me back to the timestamp, because, for example, you can look at the timestamp of each impression served, and if you identify a bucket of users that yields higher revenue in a specific time of day, you want to maximize the opportunities for watching ads in that time of day. So this is like, and you can take this really far, right? But this is just a few best practices that we've been seeing, and I think it's very interesting, and it's a trend that we see coming more and more, so it's worth thinking about it, for sure. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to connect everything that we just did on the ad monetization side to the buy side, the user acquisition side, right? Because now you can ask yourself, okay, with this data and with maximizing my LTV, now how can I buy more ad whales or valuable users? So this is the first step of doing that. When you look at your campaigns, right now we're on the UA side, we're on the user acquisition side. This is ROAS, return on ad spend. So how much is this user making to you versus how much did you spend to acquire the user, right? And of course, the spend should always be smaller than the revenue that he's making to you, because otherwise you're not cash flow, like you're not ROI positive. So this screenshot shows you 2 sources that you are buying users from. And what I show you here is the revenue that each of these sources is making you from in-app purchase. If you look at this, you would obviously go for the first game and focus on that, right? Maybe shift some budgets there and really focus on that game, because the second game is worth 30% less than the first one. Not interesting. Now, if we add the ad revenue into this picture and we optimize for the true ROAS, which is the actual in-app purchase plus ad revenue money that you're making, you suddenly see that the second source is actually worth more. And so now you have the full picture. So this changes the data set of how you buy your users by a lot. So that's the first step on how to connect this data to the user acquisition side. The second step is to bid per source, okay? Bid per source, what do I mean? I mean, pay the price, the CPI, that each source is worth to you. In this example, I'm showing you a source A and source B. That's all the sources that you have. Let's make it very simple. Your average LTV across both of those is 50 cents. And your margin goal that you got is 30%. So your manager told you this campaign needs to run on this, or this user acquisition activity needs to run on a 30% margin goal, right? So you pay 35 cents per each user that you acquire here, and that's the scale of installs that you're getting. Now, when we add a breakdown per source, it suddenly looks very different, because now we are seeing that the actual LTV in the no bidding is, or not in the no bidding in general, the actual LTV is 30 cents on source A and 70 cents on source B. Now you're still bidding 35 cents, right? So the first thing that you see here in source A, is that you're paying too much. You're paying too much by a lot. You run on a negative margin that is minus 16% and doesn't make any sense, right? Source B, you are running on a 50% margin, which is nice, right? But your goal is a 30% margin. So theoretically, you could maybe pay more and get more installs on this source. So when you go to the right side of this table, you see how it should look, right? So source A, you have an actual LTV of 30 cents. You need to bid 21 cents in order to keep your margin on 30%. That's going to mean that you get less installs of this source, but you're going to buy ROI positive, and that's all you need to do. On source B, which is even more interesting, you can pay 49 cents instead of 35, so you can pay more and still keep your 30% margin goal. And what that will do is it's actually going to get you more installs of this source. So what we just did here, one too many, is we increased our LTV, we increased our installs, and we make more revenue at the same margin. So that's pretty easy to do, right? Now, when you try to bring all of those together, like the bidding per source and optimizing by the true ROAS, right? You have a lot of sources, thousands and thousands of sources. It's a very manual work to optimize campaigns. And so you want to automate that, right? So the product that we have in order to do that, and I know that a lot of other networks do as well, is the combo optimizer, meaning a combo as in a purchase plus ad revenue. And it's an automated tool, right? So all you do is you set your ROAS goal. Let's say your ROAS goal is on day 7, you wanna have a 30% return on ad spend on any given source. So that's your ROAS goal. And now the system just starts running, and what it will do is it will adjust the price that you're paying per each source according to the actual true value of the source. And the true value is coming from ads and in a purchase, right? Because we're now measuring the ad revenue and we're adding that into our calculation here. And what that does is it does two things. It increases your LTV by 10 to 15% because suddenly you see the true value. So you know actually that you can spend more to acquire users because you hadn't thought about the ad revenue before, and now you have it in your calculation. And in addition to that, you also reach more audiences, right? So a very easy example on this is always like countries like where the in-app purchase value is low, like Brazil or Russia, but the scale is high. So usually when you look only at in-app purchase revenue, you would not focus on those geos because they don't really yield any revenue for you. But when you look at ad revenue, they suddenly might become interesting. So this is a way of kind of combining all of those things together. And I'm gonna wrap it up in the main takeaways and kind of go over everything that we just said. So the first thing was we said measure your ad revenue and know how much each user is making and who are your valuable users, right? The second step was maximize the ad revenue through simple segmentation. So you can customize the ad experience to the user. You can take this really far. You can also start simple, but that's the second step, and it's really important. And then connect all of this to the ad revenue, to the buy side, to the user acquisition side, right? So optimize for the true ROAS, bid per source, automate, and that's the three things that we see successful developers do that are able to continuously grow their games and market them at a positive margin and succeed in this competitive environment. So that's it from my part. I think we'll open this to questions now. Let's go to thank you slide. Jasmine, do you want to take over the questions part?
Yes. So guys, you can start going to the Q&A section and putting in questions, but I see that we already have a few. Lexi, looks like this first one is for you. Someone is asking, are we hitting the limit of time spent or number of apps? Is there app fatigue here? Is app fatigue here imminent?
That is a great question. So that's talking about, is there any ad fatigue in the amount of apps that people are using or playing, and that extends to games? And so really not necessarily. With improvements in network coverage and the ability to download content and to, play games at any point with 5G coming, we expect that these are all habits that will expand the overall usage. And with gaming, it's particularly interesting because we really see that there's so many new games popping up. And even within the last couple of weeks, we've seen new releases really skyrocket to the top of the charts. So there's sort of we see it more as like an expanding pool. And actually, sort of globally, the time spent on mobile was about 3 hours. 40 minutes per day. And amidst this coronavirus pandemic, we've actually seen that in China that exceeded 5 hours on average in February because we see so many users turning to mobile during this time. So I don't particularly see that we're hitting a limit. I feel like as more industries keep going and as games, especially core games are migrating over, and as well as the other side, hyper casuals, we're seeing expansion in overall time spent.
Great. And going off of what you just said about the coronavirus outbreak, someone actually has a question about that, asking, and I think Sandra, this is for you, what can we expect in terms of eCPM for apps with primarily ad monetization during the COVID-19 outbreak?
Okay, that's a really interesting one. And we've had some internal discussions about that as well. What we see in the short term is that, like Lexi said as well, there are more users playing games because they're home or, even just socially isolated, so they play games. That's one thing. So short term numbers are going up. My guess is, and it's just a guess because we have never been in this situation before, right? But my guess is that in the longer run, because I assume in-app purchases will actually go down because we might go into a recession and people will just not as easily spend money in games. And as in-app purchases go down, my guess is that game developers will see a drop on that as well. And then they will be able to they won't be able to invest as much in user acquisition, which means that eCPMs are going to drop. That's my guess, because even I know this question is for apps that have primarily ad monetization, but at the end of the day, the money in all of this circle is coming from in-app purchase advertisers that are fueling the system, right? Because inside the hyper casual sphere, basically you're moving a user from one game to the other, but there's no in-app purchase in those games, so there's no real value generated there. So that the money that fuels the system, I guess, will go down in the midterm, and that is going to decrease eCPMs. That's my guess. In the short term, we see them go up though.
Great. And now, Lexi, this one is aimed at you, but Sandra, you kind of touched on it in the middle of the webinar. Someone is asking, hey Lexi, what's the explanation you propose to the engagement increase following the ad SDK integration?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think Sandra really, she pretty much hit the nail on the head there. But basically, it's that idea that there's this sort of a strategic use of ads to enhance that gaming experience. And oftentimes that's what she was talking about, was rewarded ads. So if you interact with them and you get like currency for in-app purchases, or you might go up a level, and they're usually done at a really strategic part in the game where you would benefit. And so everything that Sandra said, I kind of underline there. And the only thing I would add is, what we tend to see is that in-app ads are particularly popular in emerging markets as a form of monetization versus app store spend through in-app purchases. And part of that is propensity to spend through the app stores. And so it's really a great way, ads are a great way to shift that burden of cost from the gamer to an advertiser. And what we've seen is that when you see the sessions are increasing in time spent, we see that to us is a validation that users don't mind. So it's sort of that trade-off you're willing to engage with. I'll engage with the ads because I can continue playing, and I can play and get to the levels I want to play at. So it is a powerful recognition of the fact that that is the in-app currency, if you will, for the user, is to just engage with the ad in exchange for advancing So realistically, we see that, yeah, it's great to see it doesn't interrupt the experience. If anything, it's enhancing that. And in some ways, allowing people who would not normally pay directly through the apps or through the games to really still derive value, but the burden of cost doesn't fall on them.
Okay, great. And Sandra, this one is for you. Do you have any benchmarks for how much ad revenue and ad whales should be making?
Okay. It's a good question. I think in general, it really depends on your specific game. So what I would do is I would look at the data set and I would just do it in a relative way, right? Because there is no benchmarks. It's very different per each game. And at the end of the day, it depends on the user that your players have to other advertisers. So it's really game dependent. So just look at the full data set and kind of like try to find the guys that make you the most, and that would be my benchmark. And then you can adjust that as you go.
Nice. Now, I have another question here for you. Someone is asking about the segmentation function within ironSource. They say, does the ironSource segment function automatically customize ads for ad whales, or do we upload their GAID, and how does it work to serve different ads to different users?
Right. That's also a great question. So in our segmentation tool, the way that I spoke about segmentation, this information would need to come from the developer. And the way that it works is that you just bucket the users according to your definition, and then you just pass us a value. It can be any value, like group A true, whatever it is. You don't even need to expose to us, by the way, what the segment is about. You pass us the value on the init of the SDK for this specific user. So if I'm a paying user and I come into your game on my phone today, you know that I'm a paying user. When you init the ironSource SDK,
Sandra, did we lose you?
it does have specific information, meaning that if you want to segment per geo, for example, if you want to show Brazilian users higher rewards in general, any Brazilian user, you can just give me that information, and the ironSource SDK knows that this is Brazilian user. So you don't need to do anything.
Great. And it looks like this will be our last question, because I see we're running over time. Someone's asking, how do I expose you or share with you my IAP data? Usually, is it on an Excel? I think it's just a technical question here.
Okay, so this would be through your attribution companies, depending who you work with, right? But anyone has that, like say AppsFlyer, Adjust, all of those guys. They have a connection to the networks where your in-app purchase data will be shared back with the networks, and that's how we know. And that's the same for any network. It's like just when you set up your attribution partner, just look out for that, like share post-install events, that's how it's called, with the networks, and then that's good to go.
Okay, looks like that's it for now. Thank you both, Sandra and Lexi, for hosting this webinar. And we'll, like I said, we'll be sending out a recording after this, so you guys can be on the lookout for that in your email. And that's it for now.
Cool. Thank you, guys.